Class in America by Michael Morales. Class in America determines the status of one's current living situation. Between the 17th century to the 21st century, those living in higher classes tend to be favored more when it comes to succeeding in life. There are a few notable occasions where someone will rise from outside of their class to a higher class, but are usually met with disdain since they don't belong. Whether it's a poor status from class or simply not being white in other cases, the idea of class hasn't changed much from then to now. No matter what century it is, the lower class is always struggling and working harder than those of a higher class. Opportunities for wealth in America have long been determined by the status of one's socioeconomic or racial affiliations. Social structures and systems that exploit the work of poor and undeserved communities continually benefit the already rich and thriving. This stark disparity is the product of wealth inequality in America. During the 18th century, indentured servitude was given to those who were willing to work off what is essentially a loan in order to be granted the freedom to own land and live off the fat of the land. But in a letter from Richard Frethorn to his parents, we see that the living conditions promised to those for their servitude weren't in the least bit. At the end of their indenture, servants received freedom dues, usually food and other provisions, and in some cases, land provided by the colony. The promise of a new life in America was a strong attraction for members of England's underclass who had few, if any, options at home. A quote from the Lumen Learning. They were malnourished and overworked to the point of death for some. If there was an incident that occurred, the master could see fit to extend the time of the servant for however long he thought fair. He owned them essentially, even though it wasn't technically slavery. The conditions were seen to be very close to that of a slave. It took a letter to Frethorn's parents begging to pay off the rest of his time with what they had at home, the amount of time to get the letter home, retrieve the materials, and send them back to America. Richard might already be dead because of the terrible conditions and diseases that killed many. Therefore, the threshold to succeed past their low-class status looked like there was little to no hope. The 19th century saw the rise of the industrial capitalism and monopoly. In a painting by Friedrich Graetz called The Tournament of Today, a set between labor and monopoly, gives a prime example of how this social Darwinism concept was the status depiction of wealth and poverty during these times. The knight on the train horse depicted monopoly, arrogance, corruption of the legislature. Sitting behind the knight is a small section of capitalist elite: Cyrus W. Field, William H. Vanderbilt, John Roach, Jay Gould, and Russell Sage, all smiling, having a good time. And the opponent of the knight is a man on a worn-down workhorse depicting poverty, labor, and strikes. Behind him is what appears to be an overly crowded group of people looking miserable, representing the poor working class with no hope to ever become part of the higher class. American workers toiled in difficult jobs for long hours and little pay. Mechanization and mass production threw skilled laborers into unskilled positions. Industrial work ebbed and flowed with the economy. The typical industrial laborer could expect to be unemployed for 1 month out of the year. They labored 60 hours a week and could still expect their annual income to fall below the poverty line. Among the working poor, wives and children were forced into the labor market to compensate. Crowded cities, meanwhile, failed to accommodate growing urban populations and skyrocketing rents, trapped families in crowded slums. A quote from Locke Wright, 2017. This one political cartoon represents the difference of wealth and poverty and rings out to even this current century. Overcrowded poor areas of struggling working class citizens see no hope for a better future for their families because they are limited to the resources allowed to their status in life. After the Great Depression in the 20th century, which saw society struggling as a whole, America entered into World War II. During this time, factories and farm fields were an essential part of the war effort to help. Women of the working class and immigrants worked during these times until the war was over. After the war, the men returned home to take back their jobs and begin earning a living to provide for their families. In the short film In the Suburbs by On Film Inc., we see the rise of suburbs, which came after young adults wanted to move into homes and neighborhoods that was spacious, clean, and booming with opportunities. This rapid growth of home ownership and the rise of suburban communities helped drive the post-war economic boom. Builders created sprawling neighborhoods of single-family homes on the outskirts of American cities. Quote by Locke Wright, 2017. The film shows the happy home of men going to work and the women staying home to care for the children and maintain these happy homes. Because the men made good wages, they were afforded the opportunities to have these happy homes. However, the video is only in the viewpoint of the white American citizen. These luxuries were not available to African Americans and immigrants. They could not move into these neighborhoods because integration was frowned upon, and having non-whites and aliens come in could lower the property value of homes. In lower working class homes, women didn't have the means to be stay-at-home moms because the income of the men wasn't enough to cover the cost of the living. Lyndon Johnson's call to end poverty and racial injustice was a major help to those who couldn't afford to provide for their families with the means for better living conditions. This included the food stamp program, Medicare, and Medicaid. The focus of Johnson's Great Society saw a focus on bettering the living for the poor. This was met with criticism from both the left and right parties. On the left, frustrated Americans recognized the president's resistance to further empowering poor minority communities and also assailed the growing war in Vietnam, the cost of which undercut domestic and poverty spending. As racial unrest and violence swept across urban centers, critics from the right lambasted federal spending for unworthy citizens. A quote by Locke Wright, 2017. This backlash led to many bad times in American history that were racially driven due to the unfair circumstances of poor black communities. We see that the struggle to fight for inequality spill over in today's society of the 21st century. It seems that one's status in society is determined by the class they are born into. It's sort of a luck of the draw scenario because we see that families of a higher class have more of an opportunity to be educated properly and succeed into something great. But families born of a lower class must struggle to pay for the cost of living, aren't given the same educational tools to help them become something more in life. It feels like an endless circle that sees no hope of becoming better anytime soon. Throughout history, the poor have always been given unfair opportunities, from the indentured servants working to maybe gain farmland after years of working for farm owners. if they didn't die before their servitude was up. To the working classes of the 19th century who were slummed and forced to struggle under the thumb of capitalism and monopoly, to the poor of the Great Depression. And then the poor African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement who strive for equal opportunities as those of the white race. Class and society had divided between the rich and the poor. How can we grow to become a better society if we have people who struggle and criticize for wanting help that can afford them better living conditions? As good as things have become compared to the previous centuries, we still have not seen enough done to help families and the youth of poverty to get a better hand dealt to them so that they may rise above in society and no longer struggle just to live. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy.